The year is 1263, and the vast expanse of the Mongol Empire is engulfed in war. For 4 long years, the grandchildren of Chinggis Khan in the house of Toluid have waged a brutal war of secession that tears at the fabric of the Mongol Empire and pours across the high Himalaya, spilling onto the Tibetan Plateau. The warring Khans are now patrons of rival Tibetan Buddhist sects who vie for control of Tibet's great monasteries with the help of their Mongol allies. In time, one sect would emerge victorious and unite Tibet under a single banner for the first time in 400 years. As recounted in Tibetan histories, however, the Mongol period begins decades earlier, in a time of relative peace, in the central Tibetan monastery of Samye, where the aging abbot and his young nephew would soon be faced with a decision that would determine the fate of Tibetan society for centuries. By the beginning of the 13th century, the religious and political world of the Tibetan Plateau had changed dramatically from the soaring heights of Tibet's imperial past. The Tibetan landscape was now a patchwork of small, highly localized kingdoms and aristocratic estates, which were connected through lucrative trade routes, a shared language, and a fragile network of clannish alliances. Meanwhile, the vast religious revival of the Tibetan Renaissance was quickly coming to a close. For 2 centuries, as Indian Buddhism declined, the wealth and knowledge of India's great monasteries had flowed to the north, drawn by the patronage of Tibet's now Buddhist patriarchs and kings. This great revival of Buddhism in Tibet did not, however, come without conflict. In the 11th and 12th centuries, numerous religious sects had emerged on the Tibetan Plateau as monastic orders divided over philosophical debates and began to seek out allies and patrons from among the Tibetan clans. As the emerging sects of Tibetan Buddhism vied for legitimacy and control of Tibet's great monasteries, a fire raged across Asia. In 1206, under the leadership of Chinggis Khan, the nomadic tribes of Mongolia were unified and embarked on an unprecedented campaign of military conquest. Within 2 short decades, the territories of their empire would stretch from the coast of the Pacific Ocean to the shores of the Caspian Sea, pressing on Tibetan lands from the north and threatening the trade routes upon which the Tibetan states relied along the Silk Roads to the east and west of the Tibetan Plateau. However, any potential plans for an invasion were put on hold when, in the year 1227, while campaigning against the Tangut Empire, Chinggis Khan was suddenly killed. In retaliation, his lieutenants razed the Tangut capital, putting their captives to the sword. And as refugees fled to the south, the great Khan's lieutenants gathered in Inner Mongolia to swear oaths of fealty to the new Khagan, or Great Khan of the Mongol Empire. Chinggis Khan was succeeded by his 3rd son, Ogadai, who in turn entrusted his son, a young warlord known as Godan, with the responsibility of consolidating a minor but strategically valuable fief along the Tibetan frontier. Eager to expand his territories and explore the possibility of southern conquest, in the year 1240, Godan ordered an expeditionary force to cross the Tibetan Plateau and ride hard into the heartlands of central Tibet. The objectives of Godan's campaign are still a matter of scholarly debate. However, his likely goal was to assess the military strength of the Tibetan clans, as well as identify leaders with whom they could negotiate the subjugation of Tibetan lands without the need for a full-scale invasion. The battalion of heavy cavalry moved quickly across the grasslands of eastern Tibet, facing little resistance from the Tibetan clans, whose cavalry was badly outclassed by the Mongolian veterans. Within a few short months, Godan's forces had reached central Tibet, where they dismounted and laid siege to the great monasteries of Reteng and Gyalakang, looting and burning the surrounding estates before setting out to the east, slowed by an ever-increasing caravan of plunder. According to later Tibetan chroniclers, the Mongolian force intended to sack two newly founded and vulnerable monasteries to the northeast of Lhasa. As they approached, however, their scouts suddenly became lost in a thick fog and were then attacked, as later Buddhist chroniclers would claim, by a shower of magical stones that fell from the sky, threatening to stampede their horses. Whether due to a landslide, an ambush, or the pious invention of later monastic historians, contemporary sources suggest that the Mongolian leadership viewed these events as evidence that behind their high walls, the monks of Tibet's monasteries were capable of powerful magic, which they now sought to understand and control. The expeditionary force returned in the summer of 1241, successful in its mission. They reported that the armies of the Tibetan states were divided and would pose little resistance in the eventuality of war. They had also returned with a name, which they put forward as their chosen Tibetan representative who would be summoned to the court of Godan Khan to negotiate surrender on behalf of the disparate Tibetan clans. At the advice of local informants, they had chosen a man named Sakya Pandita Kungé Gyaltsen, the patriarch of the wealthy Kun clan and leader of the Sakya sect of Tibetan Buddhism, which held numerous strongholds in central Tibet. Famed for his knowledge of Indian Buddhist literature, as well as his shrewd diplomatic maneuvering in Godan summons, Sakya Pandita saw a unique opportunity to expand the political position of the Sakya sect, as well as potentially avoid further violence. Traveling with his two young nephews, Sakya Pandita arrived at Godan's court in Liangshao in the spring of 1245, where he was held captive for 2 years before his first audience with the Khan. According to Tibetan records, in negotiations in 1247, he agreed to become the appointed representative of Mongolian authority in Tibet and surrendered to Godan, submitting the lands of the Tibetan clans to vassalage under Mongolian rule. In theory, this would spare central Tibet the ravages of conquest and place the Sakya sect in a uniquely privileged, but also precarious, position. According to the terms of the agreement, Sakya officials would assist in the collection of taxes levied by Mongolian authorities. However, many of the clans had not been consulted, and were they to reject Mongolian rule or the legitimacy of Sakya Pandita's negotiations, it would likely mean war with the Tibetan clans and the destructive intervention of Mongolian armies on the Tibetan Plateau. Knowing that his submission would be resisted by some rival factions, Sakya Pandita penned a now famous letter, which was addressed to the aristocratic lords and religious hierarchs of Tibet. Though aspects of the document may date to a later period, in it he argues that the military power of the Mongol Empire was beyond anything the Tibetans had ever faced. But invasion could still be avoided if the religious leaders and clan chiefs were to submit with haste and become vassals of the Mongolian Khan. He and his nephews would remain abroad, striving to convert the Mongolian lords to Buddhism and making the case for peace with the Tibetan people. Shortly after writing his so-called letter to the Tibetans, at the age of 70, Sakya Pandita died, choosing his eldest nephew, a talented young monk named Drogon Chogyal Phagpa, as his heir. In time, Sakya Pandita's efforts may well have had their intended effect. However, as aristocratic and monastic leaders debated the possibility of vassalage, a brutal succession crisis erupted in the heart of the Mongol Empire. The ensuing violence would change the political landscape of Asia for centuries. In 1248, following the sudden death of Guyuk, the third Khagan of the Mongol Empire, schisms began to form in the Mongol leadership as the grandchildren of Chinggis disputed which royal line should rule. The previous Khagan, whose widow now ruled as regent, was descended from the house of Ogadai, the third son of Chinggis. However, led by a warlord named Monkey, a challenge was posed by the descendants of Toluid, the youngest legitimate heir Following a brief but violent purge, the Ogadai were forced out of power when the rival houses of Chagatai and Jochi sided with the Toluid warlords and supported Mongke's claim to the throne. Despite his victory and ascension to the position of Khagan, Mongke's succession was quietly disputed by his brothers in the house of Toluid, who armed themselves and prepared for a civil war that seemed all but inevitable. Following the succession crisis, Godan Khan, who was descended from the Ogadai, was stripped of his fiefdom and was no longer responsible for Tibetan lands. In his place, a Toluid warlord known as Kublai Khan had been chosen to subjugate the remaining territories of the Chinese Song dynasty and consolidate Mongolian authority across the Tibetan Plateau. Building on his predecessor's relationship with the Sakya sect, in 1253, Kublai Khan summoned Phagpa to his court across the plains of northern China. When he arrived, to his dismay, Phagpa found that he was, in fact, only one of many prominent religious figures that had been invited to Kublai's court, where numerous Muslim and Taoist scholars were competing with Mongolian shamans and the sects of Tibetan Buddhism for the wealth and protection that came with Kublai's patronage. In particular, one rival Tibetan monastic figure, Karma Pakshi, the head of an eastern Tibetan sect, had already gained the Khan's favor, allegedly performing miracles and impressing the court with elaborate displays of magic. Intent to re-establish Mongolian patronage and advance the interests of the Sakya in central Tibet, in his early years as a courtier, Phagpa quickly distinguished himself in monastic debate. Under his leadership, the Sakya gradually rose to a position of prominence among the religious delegations present at court. And as his reputation grew, Phagpa was eventually called upon to perform miracles at the Khan's request, in staged displays of magical prowess that were highly valued among the Mongolian clans. One such performance, though surely embellished, is recounted in detail in a 14th century manuscript. Across the endless wind-blown steppe, the great Khan hungered for power. In the summer of the monkey year, Drogon Chogyal Phagpa came forward and spoke. "Behold this sword. With this blade I will transform my limbs into a manifestation of the Buddha. And you, great Khan, will be granted your heart's desire. Look upon my limbless body and bear witness to great wonder." So saying, his limbs and head were cut from his body, and as the Khan and his ministers looked upon the gruesome collection, they indeed bore witness to a miracle. The saint's body was transformed into a manifestation of the cosmic Buddha Vairochana. Time stopped, the world turned, and they saw the power of the Buddha Dharma. In an instant, the Tibetan reappeared to the eyes of Kublai's court, unharmed, sound of body, and protected by great and powerful magic. Through his skill in rhetoric, intimate knowledge of the inner workings of the Mongol court, and his alleged displays of magical prowess, within 5 short years Phagpa rose to become the preeminent religious authority in the court of Kublai Khan, and in the year 1258, in an elaborate ceremony, he conveyed a series of empowerments to the Khan in a ritual that established Kublai as his spiritual disciple. Phagpa had arrived in Mongolia as a child, as little more than a political captive, and within the space of 15 years, he rose to become one of the leading religious figures in Asia, who had the ear of one of the most powerful military leaders in the world. Their relationship and its military and strategic implications would soon be put to the test. In the year 1259, while fighting a prolonged siege against the armies of the southern Song dynasty, Mongke, the reigning Khagan of the Mongol Empire, was killed. In the power vacuum that followed, a Kurultai, or tribal council, was established to appoint his successor. However, as Kublai traveled to central Mongolia in the hope of laying claim to his late brother's throne, his younger brother, Arik Bok, hastily rallied the tribal assembly and had himself appointed as Khagan in Kublai's absence. The council's choice was hotly contested by Kublai, who, supported by his allies in the Western Il Khanate, proclaimed himself to be the true heir and began to prepare his armies for war. By the spring of 1260, Arik Bok and his allies among the Ogadai and Chagatai clans controlled the vast nomadic pasture lands at the heart of the empire, wielding strategic military resources and cavalry and control of several vital trade routes. However, Kublai controlled the empire's great population centers to the south, providing him with a strong economic and agricultural base, as well as significant reserves of infantry from the plains of northern China and the lands of the recently vassalized Korean Goryeo dynasty, which were supplemented by Kublai's own Mongolian heavy cavalry. The ensuing Pan-Asian conflict, known today as the Toluid Civil War, devastated the Mongol Empire. For 4 long years, battles raged across Central and East Asia as the two factions and their allied clans fought each other to a standstill. This stalemate was finally broken in the year 1264 when the House of Chagatai changed their allegiance, abandoning Arik Bok and moving to support Kublai's claim. Other significant clans soon followed, and in the autumn of 1264, defeated, Arik Bok surrendered to Kublai Khan and was imprisoned until his death. In the wake of the Toluid Civil War, the Mongol Empire was shattered, quickly dividing into 4 separate imperial states with radically different cultural and linguistic traditions. As Kublai Khan consolidated his territories and waged a grinding war of conquest against the collapsing southern Song dynasty, once again his attention turned to the Tibetan Plateau. Over the course of the conflict, Phagpa had remained in contact with his subordinates at Sakya Monastery. Under the auspices of Mongolian patronage, within the space of little more than 2 decades, the Sakya had grown to become the preeminent Buddhist tradition on the Tibetan Plateau. Leveraging the military and economic resources provided by Kublai Khan, in the mid to late 13th century, the Sakya were able to further overtake their monastic rivals, converting monasteries and enriching their supporters among the central Tibetan clans. However, as the Toluid Civil War drew to a close, Phagpa was alarmed to discover that several of Kublai Khan's Mongol adversaries had recently become patrons of rival Tibetan Buddhist sects, which now competed with the Sakya and their Mongol allies for control of Tibet itself. Chief among the Sakya's rivals were the Drogon Kagyu, an emerging sect with strongholds in central and western Tibet, who were now lavishly supported by the descendants of Arik Bok. As their influence grew among the clans of western Tibet, Kublai Khan ordered Phagpa to return to Sakya Monastery, this time accompanied by a battalion of heavy cavalry, to resolve the brewing conflict between the two sects, whether by diplomacy or force. Upon arriving at Sakya, Phagpa entreated with the Drogon Kagyu, hoping to curb their influence and expand Sakya control in western Tibet through political maneuvering. With little to offer them, however, in return for the surrender of their western strongholds, and with the Tibetan clans and Kublai's court both pressing for war, the negotiations soon reached an impasse. By the summer of 1267, Kublai's patience with a negotiated settlement with the Drogon Kagyu had run out. Phagpa was recalled to the east, and in the spring of the following year, the Mongol battalion broke camp, intending to catch their western rivals by surprise as the snows began to thaw. Within a few short months, the Western Mongol forces and their allied Tibetan auxiliaries were defeated in a series of minor engagements and forced to withdraw from the Tibetan Plateau, retreating across the Himalaya into the lands of the Chagatai Khanate. With the Drogon Kagyu's support momentarily disrupted and the armies of his rivals expelled from Tibet, in 1268, Kublai Khan began to implement this series of sweeping administrative changes that would remake the political landscape of Tibet for centuries to come. First, he created a new central Tibetan regime based in Sakya Monastery, which would be responsible for the governance of the entire Tibetan Plateau. At the head of this Sakya Tibetan administration, the Khan appointed a Tibetan regent, known by the title of Punshen. Under his authority, central Tibet was divided into 13 new administrative districts, each governed from a central Sakya-aligned monastery. These districts bore a heavy tax burden and were responsible for providing both trained soldiers and horses for Kublai's campaigns. To facilitate these sweeping changes and maintain correspondence with his outposts in western Tibet, in the years that followed, Kublai Khan financed the creation of Tibet's first postal system. This was composed of an elaborate network of relays at which riders carrying official correspondence could change their horses to continue riding hard throughout the day or be guaranteed shelter at night. Despite the burden this placed on local clans, who were responsible for the garrison of each relay, this system would remain in service for more than 600 years. Later Western scholars have often interpreted these changes as the Khan's first attempt to impose direct Mongol authority on the Tibetan Plateau, gradually reshaping central and eastern Tibet to become tributaries of the Khanate of the Great Khan. This relationship was deepened further when, in the year 1270, Kublai Khan proclaimed himself to be the emperor of a new imperial state, modeled in the Han Chinese administrative style, which he called the Great Yuan. Phagpa was made the chief counselor of the new empire and tasked with creating a written script that could be used to transcribe the diverse languages spoken across the realm. Based on the Tibetan alphabet, the Phagpa Script, as it's known today, became the official written language of the Yuan Dynasty and was used until the empire's eventual collapse nearly 100 years later in 1368. Despite intermittent warfare between the Sakya and Drogon Kagyu, across much of the Tibetan Plateau, the Yuan period was one of relative stability. For the first time in centuries, much of Tibet was politically unified, albeit under the suzerainty of the distant Yuan dynasty. That stability, however, would be sorely tested as the Yuan began to decline and withdraw its patronage from the Sakya Tibetan administration. As the Yuan were slowly eclipsed by their rivals, new monastic powers would emerge in Tibet, and once again, the shadow of religious warfare would loom large across the Tibetan Plateau. Thank you for watching. I'm Alex, the writer and director of the series, and I want to thank our backers on Indiegogo who helped finance this episode, and also our supporters on Patreon, all of these wonderful people right here. If you're interested in learning more about Tibetan history or the Tibetan Empire more specifically, you'll find all of our references in the video description, but you'll also find expanded reading lists, commentary, and annotated bibliographies for each episode on our Patreon, as well as interviews with specialists in Tibetan history and culture, like this interview with Professor Louis Donny at the University of Bonn, which covers the middle and late periods of the empire and provides much more depth than we were capable of covering in this episode. None of our Tibet-related content on Patreon is paywalled. It's all free to watch and free to use. But if you like what we're doing on the channel, please consider becoming one of our Patreon supporters to help us make more content like this in the future. But whatever you do, wherever you are, I hope you never stop learning.